My name is Jane Nakano. I'm Senior Fellow with CSIS Energy and National Security Program. And it's my great honor to welcome Peter Fraser, who is the head of the Gas, Coal, and Power Markets Division for the International Energy Agency based in Paris. He's here to launch the Coal 2017 Analysis and Forecast to 2022. That's the name of the publication. Coal has been the world's dominant fuel for more than a century, but its future use has been under quite a bit of a scrutiny today. In the power sector, certainly the robust deployment of renewables, but then combined with the cheap gas, particularly in North America, have been putting quite a bit of a pressure on coal power generation. So the IEA's Coal 2017 is one of the IEA's signature publications, and it's previously known as the Midterm Coal Market Report. This report provides comprehensive analysis of recent trends and forecasts to 2022, and in demand, supply, and trade, and not only at the global level, but at the regional level as well. And Peter's here to walk us through on some of the key highlights from its analysis and forecast, and essentially help us better understand what's happening in the coal markets and also where the markets are headed to in the near future through 2022. Peter Fraser rejoined the International Energy Agency in December 2016 in the current position, the head of the gas, coal, and power markets division. But previously, between 1998 and 2004, he was a senior electricity policy advisor with the IEA. So this is his second tour. In between, Peter worked at the Ontario Energy Board, which is the energy regulator in the Canadian province of Ontario, most recently as the Vice President for Consumer Protection and Industry Performance. From 1989 to 98, he was an energy policy advisor at the Ontario Ministry of Energy. So it's with my great pleasure, and Peter will speak for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will have a couple of questions, and we'll have some discussion up here, and then certainly open the floor for questions and answers. So please, Peter, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies for the U.S. launch of the IEA's Coal Report 2017, our analysis of the current state of global coal markets and a forecast of coal demand out to 2022. As Jane mentioned, our global launch took place earlier today in Delhi, the first time we have launched a major IEA report of global reach in India, as India became an associate member of the International Energy Agency earlier this year. I want to thank CSIS, and particularly Jane, for the work done in organizing this event. As Jane mentioned, coal's played a big role in the world's energy system for a long time. And it took until around 1910 for the consumption of coal worldwide to reach about 1 billion tons a year. To get from 1 billion tons to 3 billion tons took nearly 90 years, in part because, of course, the increased role of oil in the 20th century. But to get from 3 billion to 5 billion only took 12 years. We've just come through the far side of a big expansion in coal demand. But since around 2012, 2013, demand was at first plateaued. And then, as I'll get into now, demand's actually been dropping. In fact, last 2 years, 2014 to 2016, marks the largest two-year drop we've ever seen in coal demand. And unlike the previous occasions where we've seen such drops, this occurred during a period of global economic growth. It was also the third consecutive year that growth in consumption in China occurred. Now that's not surprising, since China was the source of much of the increase in that going from 3 billion to 5 billion tons a year. It's also worth noting that unlike many other areas, the Chinese drop is actually driven more by consumption outside the power sector. Power sector consumption of coal actually grew during this period. But it's not just China, the United States as well. In the US, it is very much a power generation story. It's about to switch away from coal to gas, which is cheaper, and also the growth in renewables, as I'll get into in a little while. So these two large coal-consuming countries have had significant drivers. But we also see in Europe continued drop in demand. Now, despite these major coal users reducing their demand, there is growth in some regions. India and a few countries of the ASEAN region contributed to this growth, and those were driven primarily by power generation demand. Now, with this drop in the last 2 years, actually in 2017, we're seeing a rebound, driven by growth in China and India. The US may have a little bit of growth, but it's really pretty flat. And this demand rebound has also supported higher prices throughout the year. So the question is what we're seeing in 2017 a new trend, or is it a blip? Let's find out. Let me start by talking about power systems in transformation. Coal provides nearly 40% of the electricity worldwide, and coal-fired generation accounts for 2/3 of the global coal consumption. It's important to understand how the power generation mix is evolving throughout the world. Let me show you what's happening in 4 countries. Now, the chart shows coal-fired generation in 2012 and 2016, and the changes in power demand and other generation supply in the period. This first chart is the United Kingdom. It's probably the case where the quickest transition from coal generation has occurred. A combination of an actual decline in coal demand and power demand, an old coal fleet, new environmental regulations, strong renewables growth, and last but not least, a CO2 price floor of an extra 18 pounds per ton over the ETS value, forced the closure of some coal plants. Coal's share in the power mix went from 40% in 2012 down to less than 10% in 2016. That's quite a rapid change. Now let me turn to the United States next. And you'll notice here, first of all, note the rather different scale here. It's a factor of 10 larger. In the US, certainly natural gas has hit coal. We've seen a drop, but it's not just a story about natural gas. Since 2012, we've seen a drop of about 275 terawatt hours of coal electricity to 2016. That's explained both by natural gas, which is over half of that, but also by renewables, which has also grown considerably. Add into that, of course, demand growth has been very weak. So coal's share of the power mix, and you can go back and 10 years ago, which was close to 50%, is now down to 30% of the power mix today. And last year, as many of you will know, gas generation actually accounted for more of the US electricity supply than coal generation. That was the first time that had happened. Next, Germany. And note again the scale, it's double the UK, but I guess a fifth of the US. In the German case, we have a quite different situation. Quite interesting to compare Germany and the UK here. Like the UK, there's a big growth in renewables. But unlike the UK, there's no corresponding shrinkage in coal-fired generation. Now, a couple of factors to explain that, as you can figure out from the chart. One is, of course, a demand increase. And secondly, and this is the big difference from the UK, gas generation actually decreased in Germany over the period. Main reason that is relative prices. Unlike the UK, they don't have a carbon price floor in Germany. They're just part of the EU ETS, where carbon prices are really low. So as a consequence, there's been very little change despite the big introduction of renewables. And finally, let's look at China. Now, in China, you've got a combination of factors going on here. But diversification in power generation from coal, which is by far the dominant source, means a lot more renewables, some more nuclear, and some more natural gas in the generation mix. But power demand growth has been bigger than the others combined. And as a result, coal generation itself has also increased during the period. So we see 4 different countries, 4 different stories with rather different impacts on coal generation. One of the common things, though, in all of them is the growth of renewables. And certainly that's going to be a big factor affecting fossil fuel generation in the years to come. But growth or lack of growth in these countries is not the whole story. There's a reality in electricity access in many developing countries that's very different from the more developed OECD countries and different even from China. If we combined Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and the ASEAN region, that's the first 4 across there, and there are more than 2 billion people there. The per capita consumption, as you can see, is rather low, averaging, if you put them together, averaging about 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita. Now that's already rather low compared to what you see in China, which is already above the global average. But it's lower still when we start to compare to the average of the OECD countries, which I think I can get by that, which is, as you can see, more than double again. Now, you notice also I did not put the US on this chart, and it's because the US per capita consumption is literally off the chart. So it's possible and even, I think, likely that developing countries will not reach the OECD level even in the future. They'll probably follow a less energy-intensive pathway. But there's no doubt that electricity consumption in these developing countries will increase with economic growth. And while we remain quite optimistic about the development of renewable energy and the future role of natural gas in some of the countries, coal will also supply a significant share of the growing electricity needs. So let's now take a look at prices. This chart will plot the prices in Europe, as that's the most liquid coal price index. After a long decline in coal prices over more than 4 years, by early 2016, futures markets had a very bearish outlook on the future of the prices. As you can see, they anticipated the prices to continue to fall. The reality was quite different. A large part of this was supply-side reforms in China, which pushed prices up and increased demand for imported coal in China. After a brief period of decline in the first quarter of 2017, prices have been moving up again. And tight supply in China, again, is one of the main reasons. I'll talk about a little more detail of that a little later. So here's part of the explanation and part of the influence in prices going forward. Since nearly half the world's coal is consumed in China and produced in China, Chinese government policy on coal is going to be very important to the world coal markets. And the government has, in a very transparent way, has defined how it's going to aim for having a price target for coal. And so it's defined 3 areas. The green area, which is I guess their comfort zone. If the price for Chinese coal moves in that range, they're fine with it. When it moves into the blue strip, above or below, that's an area where they will say they will be monitoring but will not need action. But when it moves into the red, that's when they feel action is required. Now, if I just plot that over the last couple of years, you can see their discomfort that they would have felt in 2015, early 2016. They took action to limit supply, close a lot of old and inefficient mines, limit the number of working hours of miners, And that did push the prices up, a little high, in fact. So prices since that time have been falling back down, and they're now back down or towards the upper end of the range. Towards the upper end of the range, as certainly something that we think is going to be an important factor influencing prices in the future. And part of the reason we say that is that if I plot the Northwest Europe price index, we can certainly see a pretty good correlation between the two. Let me also now briefly mention coking coal prices, because we've seen a lot of volatility in those prices in the last year and a half. So that's Newcastle, and that's the Australian prime hard coking coal. And the reason for that is Queensland, the world depends a lot on Queensland coking coal. More than half the global exports of coal are coming from Queensland. And it's when you have weather events such as Cyclone Debbie, it can have a very strong short-term impact on the coking coal price. And as you can see, prices jumping up from, or doubling in a very short time as a result of weather events. Severe rain has also been a factor in one case. And as a result, the prices jump up and down. So now let's turn to the demand-supply picture. What I'm going to present to you is a forecast region by region, and I'll build it up to the total demand you see at the top. So first of all, China. In China, we see a structural and slow decline in coal demand with annual fluctuations to meet market needs. In fact, this year, 2017, the strong power demand growth and weak hydroelectric production have meant that coal demand's increased. But in the coming years, we expect that coal use to decline, particularly in the non-power sectors, as gas is substituted for coal in residential and small industrial boilers. Together with the economic changes that we have in China, lower energy-intensive growth and progress in energy diversification, coal demand is not likely to grow substantially. In fact, we have it going down on the average of 0.1% per year over the period. So if I turn now to India, power demand growth will be robust, and this is the main driver of coal demand growth. This is despite the fact we forecast over 150 terawatt hours of wind and solar power generation growth from 2016 to 2022. But electricity demand growth in India will be more than this, and the gap will have to be filled by coal. ASEAN countries grow at an even stronger rate, averaging 5.9% per year. Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines are increasing power capacity, and investment in coal-fired generation is part of that additional capacity. Now the U.S. In the U.S., we see a decline driven by sluggish power demand, growth in renewables, and some growth on the gas side as well. However, the decline will be much slower than we've seen in recent years. Well, the story in Europe, and this is the European Union, coal's in continuous decline. The EU represents only 6% of the global coal demand, and this share will decline over time. With more countries committed to phasing out coal plants, the main question about Europe is to what extent that decline will actually accelerate. So with the other countries, which I didn't mention here, some of which you'll see increases in places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, and others where there'll be decreases, Canada, for example. But overall, there's a bit of growth, about 0.8% of growth there. But what we see overall is demand being pretty flat after this year's increase. In other words, this year's growth is a blip. And when you think about it, with the coal demand plateauing in 2012, 2013, what this means is about a decade where coal demand has been roughly the same, or roughly stagnant. So let me talk a little more detail about some of the countries. Again, let me start by turning to China. I should note that some other areas in China, the growth is going to grow. So there is going to be some growth in coal-fired power generation. not very much. There'll be growth in demand for coal conversion, some coal to liquids conversion and coal to gas conversion. But they're going to be more than offset by this decline in consumption in the small residential and industrial boilers. And of course, the changes in the economic factors, which are leading to less energy-intensive growth. Now, it also has some interesting geographic implications, which is going to affect the international coal markets more. So, for example, when we look at where those boilers are being switched out, the majority of those are in the coastal areas, as you can see here, the three areas on the right. Although there is significant also coal phase out in the other areas. It amounts to over 100 million tons of coal that we think will be switched out, coal use that we think will be eliminated, switching principally to gas. But it's not the only factor that will affect coastal consumption. A second factor affecting coastal coal consumption comes from the construction of ultra-high voltage lines, which in effect replace coal consumption in the coastal areas with coal consumption from power generation in coal areas in the interior. In addition, of course, these power lines aren't just going to take coal power. It's not just going to be coal by wire. It's going to be also wind, and in the south, the line from Sichuan, the south, hydropower by wire as well. But what it will do is reduce demand in the coastal areas, and that's important because that's where the imported coal goes to. It doesn't go into the interior; it goes to the coast. So we think the impact of these developments on global coal demand, on global coal trade, will be even more significant. Another country where this is important, where import dependency is a big issue, is India. And this slide is to show you how a coal production increase has been reducing import dependency. Now, the black bars here show the contribution from investing in renewables in reducing coal use in India, which we've assumed here comes from imported coal. But there's a second and more important factor, which I think you can see there in the light blue bars. And in these second set are the production increases we're seeing in India as a result of reforms in Coal India and other efforts to improve coal production. As you can see, these are very significant, and we saw coal imports decline into India in 2016, and in our outlook, we see further decline in those imports out to 2022, from about 101 million tons in 2016 to about 89 million tons in 2022. Now, to do this, Coal India will have to perform. We do assume that the changes that are being made will continue to be effective in increasing domestic production, ensuring that coal is produced and is able to be delivered to power plants and to other users inside India. Let me now turn to the U.S. and in particular looking at the coal capacity situation. Oops, let me see if I can, no, that's all right, that's all right. So this is the coal capacity situation looking out both the new and the retired capacity together. We see there have been no new capacity additions coming into service since 2013. On a net basis, which we can show here, we have this big drop-off in capacity through 2016 into 2017. But we do see the rate of capacity retirements declining in the next few years. So what we anticipate is a much slower decline in coal generation in the United States compared to what we've seen in recent years. Our reasoning is very much along the lines that gas prices have got pretty low, as low as they can go, and that the more inefficient parts of the coal sector are what has been retired. The older and less efficient plants in particular are the ones that have closed. Some high-cost mines have also closed. As a result, the coal industry that's left is a more efficient industry, a more competitive industry than what it was a few years ago. And as a consequence, we think it will be more resilient to future future shocks. Oops. Now, let me just talk about the trade. As you may have already surmised, we are looking at a change in trade starting with the imports in 2016, and we look at how those imports evolved to 2022. And the interesting thing here when we look at the imports is the biggest 5 coal users, we are forecasting that they will all reduce their imports over the period. However, we must admit that there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not this will occur. China and India are big markets where domestic production and imports compete. And so as we've seen this year in China, depending on the situation, imports could go up in a given year. In the case of Japan, where the decline in coal imports is due to nuclear restarts, we have 17 gigawatts restarted by 2022, as well as the uptake of renewables, imports would increase if your reactors restart. There's already a 4.6 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity under construction in Japan. In Korea, things are even more uncertain, as there are over 10 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity has been commissioned or is under construction, but the new government has been making moves to reduce coal's share in the power mix. Now you see that how we've built up the trade number for 2022. Now if you look from the right side of the chart, this is how it looks on the export side. And among the export, Indonesia is one of the, will be seeing a large decrease in exports. And the reason for that is increasing domestic demand, in part because of more coal-fired power plants in Indonesia, and difficulties in cost competitiveness of increasing production. So we expect they will significantly reduce their exports. The U.S., on the other hand, we have a very small increase, certainly not nearly the scale that we're actually seeing this year. It is the swing provider, and it has enough mining and port capacity on the East Coast and can react if prices are right. I'd like to focus the last part of my presentation on carbon capture, utilization and storage, or CCUS. And that's because carbon capture, utilization and storage is one of these low-carbon technologies that's been making some progress, but not nearly enough. This technology has been proven in 4 examples of facilities recently commissioned that I want to mention to you. First of all, here in the United States, in Illinois, there's a corn to ethanol facility in the U.S. where the CO2 is stored in an aquifer, about 1 million tons of CO2 per year. The Petronova plant in Texas is a 240 megawatt power plant capturing up to 1.6 million tons of CO2 to be used for enhanced oil recovery. Quest is a Canadian oil sands project which can capture up to 1 million tons of CO2 and store it in a geological structure nearby. And finally, CSIS Emirates Steel is a project in Abu Dhabi in which CO2 captured around 0.8 million tons per year in the steelmaking process is used for enhanced oil recovery. These projects have common characteristics. The CCUS is installed on existing operating assets which have a sustainable business model. They're relatively low technology risk with attractive and well-understood storage geology. They exist because of coalition of public and private stakeholders. And there's also a clear source of revenue to cover the CCUS costs over the lifetime of the asset. With the right approach, CCUS can work, and in some cases is working. But despite these examples, progress on CCUS is lagging far behind other low-carbon technologies. There is broad agreement among energy leaders from both government and industry that urgent action is needed to support CCUS. For without it, the climate challenge will be much bigger, and the climate change mitigation will be much more costly. That's why we at the IEA, together with countries and industry leaders, are working to give a new momentum to this technology. Indeed, without CCUS, coal use will be seriously constrained in the future. The IEA is committed to pushing the global dialogue on CCUS forward, an agenda that must involve governments and industry to develop the new regulations and to spur investments. Last month, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, with the IEA Executive Director, Fatih Birol, co-chaired a high-level summit which brought together more than 20 countries and the CEOs of the world's largest energy companies that share a commitment to CCUS. We must build on this commitment and now move forward and act. So finally, to wrap up, let me conclude with some main messages. Global coal demand is set to stagnate through 2022. That 2017 increase, it's a blip. Second, the structural but slow decline in China. China is taking place with fluctuations up and down determined by market needs. So we may see China go up as we did in the 2017 blip, but it can go down again too, depending on conditions. India, South Asia, and Southeast Asia are leading the growth that offsets the declines that we're forecasting. Fourth, the global trade numbers actually are contracting, but uncertainty in this estimate is pretty high, given all the uncertainties in the big importers. And finally, coal use in the future will be constrained without carbon capture, utilization, and storage becoming practical and implemented widely. Now, at today's launch in Delhi, after our presentation there, we had comments from the Secretary of Coal about the report. And the Secretary commented that coal will continue to supply baseload energy, but he also was very supportive of the idea of carbon capture and utilization. He didn't actually mention storage. He wanted to emphasize that the CO2 had to be used. So I think our messages are getting through, and I think our outreach to new countries in our association members is really paying dividends, and we're having an influence on the coal policies in the world today. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. It's very comprehensive. I mean, we're looking at all these sort of a major market mover countries, but within the country, there are all these, the power market is fast evolving, and certainly, there's coal usage in non-power sector as well that are, impacted by a lot of, different concerns, whether it's socioeconomic or political, sort of market-oriented. But I wanted to, since you're in Washington, I wanted to ask you some of the U.S.-focused questions. You did already mention that the increased U.S. coal export this year is probably more of a blip. But I guess, and I realize that it's very much, driven by market fundamentals. But for example, recently the U.S. started exporting coal to Ukraine, and it had, it was looking at, I guess, specific type of coal. I mean, I guess there are always certain lower hanging parts, the potential markets that a U.S. coal still could be appealing, I suppose. I mean, or I might be mistaken, but if you can sort of help, elaborate on that, that would be great.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, thermal coal market and the metallurgical coal market are different. Even though our overall demand forecast for metallurgical coal is quite flat, actually 2022 levels is globally the same as 2016. There are certain growth in certain countries, particularly India, where we see significant growth in metallurgical coal demand. I know a new coal mine has opened in the United States this year, and it's metallurgical coal. Well, that's no surprise. There are in certain countries a need for more metallurgical coal, and as a result, I think there are some opportunities there. Overall, we actually we didn't break it out in the analysis there, but it's in the actual report, which I should show you. Looks like this. That we actually look at Ukraine and, I guess, Eurasian countries together, and it is one of the other areas where we see some opportunities. So that is an area where there are also some possibilities for increased consumption. In many areas, of course, they're rather close to Russia, but of course Ukraine is in a rather different situation when it comes to that. Too close to Russia. But because the Russian competitiveness has improved quite a bit with the fall in the ruble. So in other countries, we think probably the Russians are in the best position to take advantage of that.
And if I'm not mistaken, I guess the met coal export contributes, or it's a lot more profitable for U.S. coal exporters than, I guess, thermal coal side. But to what extent do you think that could really ease the pain that a U.S. coal industry is experiencing in the balance sheets?
Well, that's a hard one. We didn't examine U.S. balance sheets, so I can't give you an opinion about how much it is. As I said, overall met coal's flat, so it's not like met coal's growing a lot. It's just that there are particular countries where that's opportunities, and so you do see a new mine opening here, and I think that's a clear indication that the market thinks there's something there. Certainly, the dependence on Queensland for metallurgical coal exports is something that maybe even customers will be looking for other sources of supply.
And I guess within the U.S. discussion on the future of coal, we do pay a lot of attention to socioeconomic challenges, namely, coal mining sector, how they're under quite a bit of pressure. Does your report give some sense of the rate of, I guess, automation, the use of, how it's becoming sort of a modernized upstream, and how that may impact the labor force issue?
Yeah. We didn't address labor force explicitly. We looked at very much from the cost perspective, and we've seen significant productivity improvements in the U.S. sector, as well as actually in other countries as well, with this recent shakeout in the industry and the very low prices they saw until last year.
And I also wanted to just cover two more markets quickly. But I do certainly want to save some for the audience to ask. But of course, China has been the major importer of the global coal supply, and you did touch upon how there has been the supply side efforts, and these supply side reform has been focused on improving safety, the standards. Also improving the efficiency and et cetera. What's your assessment of the progress that they're making on some of these targets?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Our assessment, and we were fortunate this year that we had an official from Shenhua Coal working with us on this report. So it was very helpful to us in terms of getting certain information that otherwise would have been difficult for us to obtain. And that's thanks to our association. We were able to do that thanks to our association with China. And on that, what we've seen is we have certainly the information or the data that we've got suggests there has been a significant improvement in cost reduction, that the policies have been effective. Now, of course, with one of the policies, which was the number of working days regulation, they found actually it caused this overcorrection. The prices spiked. Imports came in, and so they realized they had to relax that. But I think again, this is trying to control, imposing the market mechanism and finding the limits, find the limits of how much they can impose on this. But I do think they have seen some real progress there.
And you've also touched upon high voltage transmission and how that may impact, I guess, trade flow. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Well, it's just again, when it comes to China, the scale of this is enormous, and so we're talking hundreds of terawatt hours of power that now can move from Western China to Eastern China or from Southeastern China to the coast. And this will make it much easier to have this kind of interregional trade of electricity. And presumably much more efficient. At the same time that the coastal areas are also doing what they can to reduce their own coal consumption, or in some cases the emissions from that, as we see much more on the boiler side, but also in the power gen side. So I think it's going to be an attractive option. China's also in the middle of a power reform, and with this additional infrastructure build that should actually hopefully make the power reforms more effective.
Maybe one, I guess, last question for this segment to use. And on India, so India still has about 3 million people that do not have access to modern form of electricity, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I guess the utilization of the thermal power fleet, especially coal, I mean, it's predominantly coal, it's fairly low. If I'm not mistaken, it's in low 60s or even like maybe high 50s. What's happening there?
Well, I think the utilization factor, or load factor, is really more a function of how quickly they've been building the coal plants versus how quickly the demand's been going up. But the government has made specific efforts to improve the financial health of the distribution companies, and also at the same time imposed a requirement to go and connect everybody. So the two need to go in hand. If the companies don't have any money, they can't actually connect people. A lot is put on the distribution companies to make this happen, but they are quite determined, and there's a lot of, we're told that a lot of progress has been made on this. So we do expect most people in India who are not yet have access to electricity to get it through a grid connection, say that rather than a more decentralized option. Yeah.
Great. Now it's your chance to ask him a question. Sure. And I guess 3 basic ground rules. 1, please wait for the microphone to get you, and then please identify your name, yourself, and affiliation as well.
If you could stand.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Ting Li from Duke University, a fellow at Duke Energy Initiative. My question is, are there any work project going on at IEA looking at China's overseas investment in coal power plants? Thank you.
Well, we certainly look at it all the time in terms of just in order to understand where it's going. We do look at Chinese coal power plant investment and try to keep on top of that. We publish every year a World Energy Investment Outlook, and of course China is a significant part of world energy investment, so that is covered there. We also have working on some initiatives to look at flexibility of power plants, because that with renewables integration, that's becoming a bigger issue. So that's an initiative that we're doing in partnership with the Clean Energy Ministerial to look at the flexibility of thermal power plant operation in order to see what's the ability of an existing fleet of coal plants to integrate renewables.
If you could stand, sir.
Yeah, it's Robert Lanza from ICF. Thank you for coming. There's a large number of LNG export terminals in the permitting pipeline in the U.S., and I wanted to know how you considered those in your analysis of worldwide coal exports and LNG exports. Thank you.
Okay, good question. First of all, we actually produce a separate gas report where we look at the impact on LNG exports. We see U.S., for example, exporting about 82 billion cubic meters by 2022. Now, last year was only 5. When we look at it, when we look at gas versus coal in a particular country, obviously we look at the relative economics. And in most of the world, gas is a more expensive way to make electricity. And as a result, it's often a policy, it's either a policy push or it's a domestic resource in the case of a place like Malaysia, which has really driven gas use there. And when we look forward, we look at what the changes in government policy are. And of course, we look at the power demand. And that's how we come up with our estimates.
And if you could please stand, sir.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. My name is Sergio Martinez. and I am a former intern in the energy program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And I wanted to ask you a question about the renewables that you mentioned at the beginning in the energy matrix in the United Kingdom and the US. Do you anticipate any change in the coal market given the pressure on climate change commitments and the sustainable development goals in terms of the renewables? How will that come into play and all this? Thank you.
Okay. I think the best way to answer your question is to make reference to our World Energy Outlook, which is more of a long-term look at the world energy markets. And we have what we call, our main scenario is what we call our new policy scenario. And broadly speaking, we see coal demand remaining flat out to 2040, even with the commitments to meet the 2030 nationally defined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And the reason for that is that we, in many countries, or not many, in some countries, nationally defined contributions includes an expansion of coal. So we actually overall, and with other countries now committing to get out of coal, which we've incorporated here where we can, at least for power gen, we actually still see overall coal demand remaining roughly flat. Now, we also look at a scenario where there's more aggressive action, which we call our sustainable development scenario. And so we assume a whole bunch of other policies are implemented to allow us to significantly reduce our CO2 emissions by 2040. In that case, coal drops quite dramatically from current levels, probably back to levels you haven't seen since the 1970s. So, but that would take, in our view, quite strong policy action to change course.
Thank you. Jonathan Chanis, Securing America's Future Energy. There's vast differences, as you know, in coal quality. And has the report taken that into account and thought about what the economic and environmental trade-off would be if there was a substitution of North Appalachian or Central Appalachian coal for, say, German or Polish lignite?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I can address that specific example, but I can give you an example where we've thought or considered it, which is when we were looking at Indian coal imports. There's an ability, again, the policy of the government is to decrease imports as much as they can. At the same time, there's a lot of coastal coal-fired power plants which are relying on imported coal, specifically because of the kind of quality characteristics that you mentioned. And so when we do the analysis, and this applies to the market report and other analysis we do, we obviously have to take that into account. There's kind of a hard floor to how much you can reduce imports in that case. So with existing plant, there are limitations as to what kind of coal you can use, and we try to take that into account.
Bob Hershey, I'm a consultant. How are things looking for met coal versus steam coal?
Well, actually, globally, met coal is flat out to 2022. But mentioned earlier, places like India, actually we have some in Korea as well, we see some possibilities for increases. We actually see some offsetting decreases in places like China because of the economic transformation that's going on there. Steam coal, we actually, I would say after this year's increase, it's probably pretty flat out to 2022 as well. Again, with the kind of regional differences I was talking about in the presentation. It's really increases in some places offset by decreases in others.
If you could please stand, sir.
Hi, my name is Richard, and I'm a student at the George Washington University. You spoke about how coal demand is raising in a lot of the developing world as demand for energy expands. However, you spoke a bit about India, which produces coal, but a lot of energy demand is starting to arise in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm curious if coal, in your mind, is a reliable energy source to these rural communities, and how it can be brought there if it is, and how could it be done to ensure that it's sustainable and beneficial to the communities in the long run? Thank you.
Well, it's a complex question, and something that we had actually issued a report about a couple months ago called our Energy Access Report, which is a report affiliated with the World Energy Outlook. And we looked at areas there where grid supply of electricity had not been, people don't have access to electricity. And we saw that a combination of policies, in some cases grid extension, like we're probably going to see in India, but also other policies, particularly with solar PV these days, that now actually make it much more economical to expand access and connect more people to give more people access to electricity. Coal in certain countries in Africa, when they have the resource, of course, South Africa, you know very well, is a big user of coal. Is obviously an option for some of the countries, and particularly when it's their own resource. I think you see in the big users of coal, whether it's China or India or the United States, that obviously there's a preference when you have the resource. But the question of whether to go if you want to build a big power plant, what technology to use, coal price is rather competitive compared to LNG, for example, at today's rate. So that remains an option for some countries, but obviously the attraction is much stronger if they have their domestic resources, which can be developed. And so, for example, we see in Pakistan today, well, it's not in Africa, I know, as you see development there because there are coal mines that can be developed as well as the imported coal that's going in.
Thank you, Peter. Bob Eichord from the Atlantic Council. I was interested in this issue of the competition between LNG and coal, and particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Because, I mean, I think, when coal prices were really at their lowest, you had a lot of decisions made by, Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, Bangladesh, et cetera, to develop coal plants. Very much based on importing Indonesian coal, which has been very low cost and proximate to these markets. I get the sense, though, that countries in the current environment of low LNG prices are also looking at that as an alternative in the future. And I think that I'm not so sure that the projections of large growth are necessarily going to be borne out by if gas prices continue to be low. Not that there won't be, but it'll vary from country to country. But what's your sense of that in terms of the sustainability? And also, you mentioned the problems in Indonesia because of in terms of both domestic consumption as well as the government's non-enforced policy of trying to cap coal exports. Are there other options for these countries if indeed Indonesia is not a reliable supplier in the future?
Well, there's certainly other coal exporting countries in the region, and so that's their first option if they feel for some reason Indonesia is not going to be the reliable supplier, because looking at Indonesian policy even, they may turn to Australia or other countries. In terms of the coal versus LNG, certainly our view, although it's not true today if you look at the spot markets, is that LNG is going to be fairly inexpensive for the next few years because there's a lot of LNG capacity coming online, much greater than we anticipate the demand to be. So as a result, there will be a short-term opportunity. But we do think prices will need to move up over time in the LNG market. So if you build an LNG facility, we do think the surplus, which will result in low prices, will shift in. The prices of LNG will move up over time. So there's also a risk there if you go that route. In a lot of countries where we deal with, Indonesia is also an association member, but in other countries in the region, we certainly counsel a diversity of sources, and with the falling cost of renewables, there's a lot more interest in including that in the mix. And part of our work is actually talking to them about integration issues and how you deal with that, because it may be something they're not, the utilities there might not be comfortable with. So we do try to engage them on that, and of course on energy efficiency as well.
Hi, Elizabeth Loss is from Duke University. I'm wondering if you all track in this report or elsewhere potential shocks to the system that might create a significant divergence in the short and medium term from your forecasts? And if so, are you most concerned with natural disasters, political instability, technological innovations, and shocks that could either push the coal up or down? Is that something you all are keeping an eye on?
Well, first, absolutely. The International Energy Agency was created to deal with oil security, and we were created as a result of an oil shock. So it's certainly energy security is very central to the work we do. And in the past, it was oil. Today, it's much more natural gas, I would say than coal. But we also look at the indirect impacts of, say, a shock on the gas side. For example, in recent months, there's been this diplomatic issue between Qatar and its neighbors. Well, Qatar supplies about 30% of the world's LNG. So if something were to happen that would take Qatar out of the market, and there's no reason to suspect that that would happen, but certainly it's something we do keep an eye on behalf of our member governments. So then we also then ask ourselves, well, what if that happened? We do think about these other issues. Well, what if something like that were to happen? What are the impacts on the other markets? But as you can see in the report, we also look at natural events. In the case of the metallurgical coal, that's really what drove those price spikes and really impressed us as, I'd say, the relative fragility of the supply chain in met coal. So, but we're more drawing lessons from the past there rather than, say, looking ahead in that case.
Thank you. This is a follow-up question on my first one. I'm wondering, in terms of looking forward, as you mentioned, like China domestically is reducing the coal because of demand and the new technology. When you look at its investment overseas, especially through the One Belt, One Road initiative, do you see that they're going to maybe apply similar rules? Are you tracking those kind of, environmental regulations, or how do you think this is going to affect the coal market in general in the Southeast Asia area?
Okay. Well, we do see China involved in coal plant investment in other countries, and also in technology transfer. They have built a lot of coal plants in the last decade or two, so they have a lot of technology, and through One Belt or One Road or other financial initiatives, they are helping to finance certain types of coal investments. The expectation certainly in our report is that kind of support will continue. A lot of the technology, of course, for recent Chinese coal plants are actually pretty good. Is actually in terms of efficiency and in terms of emissions controls conventional emissions control that you can have.
And I was going to just quickly add, it's much more from, I guess, these multilateral banks where the world is interested in seeing higher standards, for multilateral institutions to be calling for higher standards, as opposed to manufacturers voluntarily saying, well, we want to sell you higher efficiency or higher performance. But I think there's a lot of discussion going on, perhaps between AIIB and the World Bank. A lot of capacity building is underway. So it's something that I also follow pretty closely. So I guess we'll stay tuned. Any other question?
Thank you very much. My name is Audrey Tausch. I'm an independent consultant. And the very last point on your slide up there that says coal use will be constrained without CCUS, and that you are working with the industry and policymakers to build momentum. What kind of momentum? Are you saying for a carbon price, perhaps? Because CCUS will make coal more expensive unless there's something to make it more economic to use CCUS.
Right. This is much more of a technology focus to get it implemented, to try to find the right frameworks to make sure coal CCUS can be more widely applied. And our argument has been that that with all the coal out there, coal generation out there, that we're going to need technologies like this to complement the other low carbon technologies to significantly reduce emissions in the future. And if we don't get it, if it turns out that we can't find a wide-scale application of CCUS which is economic compared to other low-carbon technologies, then that will severely constrain coal. So not specifically a carbon price or that specific policy instrument. It's really much more of a technological focus, but much more in terms of demonstration and implementation of the technology, rather than the policy framework, which might make that more attractive.
Thank you.
Okay.
Then let me ask you a couple more questions. We've talked about CCS, CCUS a little bit, but we haven't really talked about high efficiency, low emissions technology. Where do you see, what sort of future do you think that particular genre of technology, has going forward in the coal fleet?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot of interest among people who are building coal in these high efficiency, low emissions technologies. But a lot of what we've seen are really still, there's Osaka Coolgen, there's a few other cases like that, which are really quite impressive. But the economics isn't compelling, say, just going to using a conventional supercrit and other end of pipe controls. So that's been the issue, is the economics really haven't been compelling to encourage widespread adoption of these kinds of technologies. And if the feeling is you're still going to have to put on CCUS or CCS on top of everything else, that might really drive your economics. That might make it completely uneconomic. So we're not, certainly not in this report, we're not predicting much of it to happen.
Okay. When I think of the U.S. landscape, there's very little appetite for, Healy, particularly when, there's very little investment going into the thermal, particularly coal-fire generation asset period, right? So yeah, as you said, if you're looking, you have to have, I guess, you have to know that your asset will, stay, running to be able to, recuperate all of the investment. It's a very challenging picture. I think especially in a lot of OECD economies, perhaps, where the power demand has been stagnant. And that leads me to sort of a question about India. I mean, India is, certainly the power demand is growing, coal consumption is growing, but the fleet modernization, I think there's potential for these higher efficiency or perhaps CCUS, as you mentioned from the podium, CCUS. At the same time, we're starting to hear in sort of, through media sources, there's starting to be a little bit of concern about the coal fast becoming stranded asset. I mean, there are a lot of projects that are now completed. I don't know if you, or your staff travel to India often to sort of get the more of a micro level perspective on what's happening. Is it because of the competition from renewables? Is it more of a financial issue? Is it, what's behind this picture?
Well, there are a lot of things going on, and India is a big country, and it can be different things in different parts of the country. But certainly, one of the overall factors is how quickly power demand is slowed. Growth has slowed compared to a few years ago. I think so. You've had coal generating capacity double in India in 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. Power demand hasn't really kept up with that growth, and now you have renewables coming in on top of that. So as a result, it's quite easy to see why you'd have these cancellations, and that the continued capacity additions in coal are going to be much slower over the next 6 years compared to the last 6.
Could you put a number on how many new plants are being built with supercritical generators? Well, actually, particularly in ASEAN.
Short answer is no. I don't have the number handy. I would say most of them, but okay, yeah.
And I also wanted to, I guess, talk a little more about, I guess, midstream transportation. We did talk a little bit about the Chinese situation regarding the ultra high voltage transmission lines.
Yeah.
Is that a potential challenge in India as well, or not the challenge per se? Is that something that India will be looking at closely as they try to introduce more renewables and then try to get the electricity to the demand center?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what studies have been done on that. Interesting, I saw a map today of where the resources are, and they tend to be on the western part of India, and the coal tends to be on the east. Whereas the dynamics are a little different in China, where the coals are relatively remote from the high population areas, and so the opportunity of coal by wire or renewables by wire is greater. But yeah, certainly that's another technology that the Indians could look at.
Any other question? Yes, Bob.
I'll ask another one. You probably have followed the debate about coal in the U.S. and in terms of the issue of the market implications and whether market design should be adapted to value through capacity payments or other aspects, the base load and fuel security issues. Are you seeing that in other countries too? I know we had discussions with Germany when they were debating whether to put in place capacity payments for generators. And is that something that you think makes sense to pursue in terms of the IEA's advice and consultations with countries about their market designs?
Well, certainly, first of all, we a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago now, we published a book called Repowering Markets, where we actually looked at capacity market designs in different markets. And of course, here in the U.S., in PJM, which I know is a big area of interest right now, there is a capacity market. So it's not just the current issue, and not just here in the U.S., may I give the example of Australia, is not just that we originally looked at the renewables question as a question as how do we integrate these renewables into the system. So that's an addition question. But the question that quickly follows is in most market designs, well, you add extra generation into the system responds by lowering the price, and then some of those generators exit. So in other words, there's a subtraction problem. If those generators have a certain reliability characteristics that you're losing compared to the new generation that's coming in. So in the case of Australia, which has a relatively long, relatively narrow transmission system serving its national energy market, they were finding in some places at the end of those, one of the ends, South Australia, that it was hard to keep the system reliable as gas plants in that area were closing. And so as a consequence, the government proposed about a couple months ago now a new requirement on the part of retailers to say, in the case of Australia, we think we need to have inertia, which is the big rotating masses associated with everything. And inertia helps you if you have a big plant goes offline. It helps recover, or another upset, like lose a major transmission line. It helps recover the system automatically. It's just sort of, it is like the word describes, something that's there. And if you have nothing but wind and solar, you don't have it. You don't have that anymore. So they say we're going to put in a new rule that everybody who is acquiring power, like retailers for their customers, will have to buy inertia from generators. So that helps keep these big generators in the marketplace. And so that's one way of dealing with trying to ensure reliability as you start to transition to more and more renewables in your power system. So that's an area of current interest of ours, and it's something we're going to spend more time looking at next year.
Great. This was fantastic. I mean, there are a lot of, I guess, technical questions, but I very much appreciated your sort of insights, also very thoughtful sort of observations on what's happening in the power market, certainly here, as well as in other key markets, and also in general, the role that the government has been playing, but then also how there's still a lot of scope for cooperation with the private sector, for example, CCUS, CCS. Thank you so much, and I do hope that you'll be back next year and share your, additional insights in the next year, within the next 12 months. We'll see. I mean, what sort of a supply and then demand dynamics may, develop. So, but again, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking leaders.